The American film industry. Reform, revolution, reaction.
From the 1920s to the 1950s, the American film industry grew in regards to political and social influence on society. Previously, there was not a concrete corporate cinema industry, but in the 1920s, silent cinema became a corporation. Films started expanding from their foundations and became a big business by the mid-20s. This is where the classical Hollywood cinema had its roots. It evolved during this period, which was commonly called the silent era.
The silent era took place between two cataclysmic events, World War I and the stock market crash, which consequently impacted the industry. Earlier films had not focused on the delicate subject of war, but due to World War I, war became a main focus in the film industry.
An example is the film Wings, produced in 1927 by Paramount. The film focused on American pilots' camaraderie and the tragedy of lives lost in World War I. Another example is The Big Parade, which was produced in 1925 by MGM Studios. It was based on a book by a Marine, Lawrence Stallings, who had written about his experiences in the war. The war films during this time had the effect of allowing the American people to have a more intimate experience with the war and the men who fought in it. It helped to elicit support for the war and in this way became an influential political tool. During the 1920s, America was experiencing a social change. Social life was becoming less rural and more metropolitan. The time period is commonly called the Roaring Twenties because of the massive amount of innovation and change in society. The Roaring Twenties were largely contributed to by the film industry because as its popularity grew, so did its influence on society. Actors and actresses became icons that were looked up to. In particular, actresses became very prominent in this age as sex symbols. Society reacted to the sexuality of women and their dress by imitating them. Screen stars promoted the fashionability of short, bare-shouldered dresses. Whereas most of society reacted positively to these on-screen images, some criticized it. The interaction of men and women on screen influenced society and contributed to a sexual revolution in youth culture. An example of this promiscuity on screen is DeMille's 1919 film, Male and Female. In this film, the actress Gloria Swanson shows a glimpse of her breast.
As you can see, from the beginning, films had political and social reactions from society. The silent era was only the beginning of an industry that became more influential as reforms were put into place and it evolved over time.
The Golden Age! The 1920s became the 1930s and the Silent Age became the Golden Age. The Golden Age is characterized by the revolution of sound and color films. In this era, films became more advanced and the industry experienced many reforms as it evolved. The introduction of sound and color into films created talkies, which revived the appeal to Hollywood's films. New movie stars became icons for the young to imitate, and new genres of film were created. Also, during this time, the studio system rose to a huge status. There were 8 major studio systems: Warner Brothers, Paramount, Columbia, Universal, 20th Century Fox, MGM, and RKO. Together, these studios, called the Big 8, produced 95% of American films, and they dominated the film industry from the 1920s to the 1950s.
The introduction of sound was the factor that started the Golden Age. The Warner Brothers made a risky investment in the Vitaphone sound system and produced The Jazz Singer in October 1927. It was the first talkie and was a huge success. The Warner Brothers became Hollywood's hottest film factory, and soon all the others were imitating them. This led to the sound revolution, which is described as happening almost overnight. In only 24 months, Hollywood produced exclusively talkies. The main changes that this brought was soundproof stages, wired theaters, and new actors. Many actors that had been popular in the silent era were now replaced by actors who took voice lessons. The talkies were widely welcomed by society and created a very successful, lucrative era. Along with the addition of sound, reforms were also made to the industry to bring color to the screen. These two reforms transformed the industry by increasing film popularity. The most famous films of the era were Victor Fleming's Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, both produced in 1939. The success of these reforms led to the development of many new film genres such as gangster films and horror films.
However, the advent of sound and color also had negative effects. Now, curse words and violent sounds, such as gunshots, could be heard, and sexual images could be more clearly displayed. There was a rise in crime, violence, sexual infidelity, profanity, and nudity shown on screen. Society began to complain that films had a negative influence on public morality and called for censorship to be reformed. In response to society's complaints, censorship was reformed, and in 1930, the Hollywood Production Code was established. Now films first had to receive a seal of approval from Joseph Breen and the Production Code Administration to be released. This is an example of what a stamp of approval from the Production Code would look like. Not only did this code have the effect of cleaning up films, it also improved actresses' roles in films. Because they could no longer be viewed as merely sex symbols, actresses began to have more important and independent roles in films.
My heart springs, my tangled around. Well, baby, I'm a funny. Sorry, I make you wait. I'm funny.
Wartime Hollywood.
The Hollywood film industry experienced a big change during World War II. The film industry responded to war effort by making films to raise American spirits and by having film stars enlist in the military. The film industry coordinated with the Office of War Information, which is important propaganda for World War II, to record the nation's wartime activities. Films during this time became more realistic than they had been in the 1930s. They also offered escapist entertainment, reassurance, and patriotic themes. For society, Hollywood's films of the war years were used as propaganda and morale boosters.
One of the most important roles of the film industry during World War II years was to produce propaganda. Some people did not like the portrayal of war in films. For example, critic David Denby wrote in Premiere, "World War II pictures look childish and banal, morally hapless in the dehumanization of the enemy, naive in their glib underestimation of the spiritual devastations of combat, their unshadowed faith in democratic and egalitarian American future." End quote. However, directors were constrained by government censorship and the Production Code. Still, films had significant impact on society. It became almost a weapon of war because of its influence on society. The film industry became a transmitter of wartime policy and life and death messages. It was shocked and enlightened by motion picture propaganda of Nazis. The alliance between the government and Hollywood generated new kinds of movies and a new attitude towards them. Because of its ideological power and influence, the Hollywood films became objects of censorship. People became suspicious of Hollywood because they thought that they were attempting to control politics and control representations of sex, violence, and general mores. Whack investigations of Hollywood film industry focused on the danger of communists could pose if allowed to influence movie content. In 1947, 10 Hollywood writers had to serve prison sentences, and hundreds of Hollywood employees were blacklisted. Beginning in September 1941, the government began investigation into whether Hollywood was campaigning to bring World War II by inserting pro-British messages into films. Senator Gerald Nye charged Hollywood with producing, quote, "at least 20 pictures in the last year designed to drug reason of American people, set aflame their emotions, turn hatred into blaze, and fill them with the fear that Hitler will come over here and capture them." End quote. Hollywood had a few anti-Nazi films, for example, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, but they really awoke slowly to the fascist threat. Hollywood really awoke to this fascist threat after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they began to contribute to war effort.
The film industry really became influential during World War II. It transformed from just a form of entertainment to an important political and social tool. An example of a propaganda movie is Casablanca, directed by Michael Curtiz in 1942. It is a romantic story of self-sacrifice and heroism. Another example is a propaganda film called Our Enemy, the Japanese. It was made by the Office of War Information and the Bureau of Motion Pictures to inform citizens about the war. From the 1920s to the 1950s, the American film industry grew in regards to political and social influence on society.